It's said that in medieval times, the streets of European cities were so fragrant with filth that residents could identify their neighborhood not by sight, but by scent. Imagine that. Home wasn't where your heart was. It was where your nostrils gave up first. Let's take a slow, aromatic stroll back to about the year 1347. Yes, the same year the Black Death made its grand European debut. But we'll quietly back away from the plague for now. We're interested in the everyday eau de medieval life, the kind of daily stink that even peasants forgot to notice after a while. First, let's set the scene. There you are, in a bustling market town. Let's say York, not New York, just old, soggy, medieval York. The streets are narrow, the roofs lean in like gossiping neighbours, and beneath your boots is a sort of soupy mystery. You don't ask what it is, you just keep walking. The town lacked what we might generously call waste management. Citizens customarily dumped their chamber pots, also known as indoor buckets of yesterday's regrets, right out of windows into the street. There was a phrase for alerting passers-by, "Gardez-l'eau," which means watch out for the water. Although, to be fair, it was rarely just water. Now remember that most people only had one set of clothes, two if they were scandalously wealthy. These outfits were rarely washed, and for complex reasons. First, soap, when available, was made with lye, which is essentially aggressive salt that moonlights as a skin irritant, not ideal for your only tunic. Second, washing clothes meant removing them, and removed clothing meant exposure, and exposure meant scandal, or at least a bit of drama no one wanted before breakfast. And third, most people truly believed that bathing, or getting very wet, could open the pores and let in disease. The solution? Stay dry, stay alive. And layer. Lots of wool. Thick, blissfully insulating, beautifully itchy wool. With this in mind, imagine the subtle perfume of communal living. In a household of 10, because privacy was a fantasy only monks and cats enjoyed. You might share a straw-stuffed sleeping space with siblings, parents, and things that burrow. Personal hygiene amounted to wiping around with a bit of coarse cloth, avoiding eye contact with cold water, and perhaps dabbing on a fragrant herb like lavender if you had a herbalist friend or loose morals. Even royalty, those velvet-draped symbols of power and empty purses, weren't immune to the reek. King Louis XIV of France, though not quite medieval, but close enough for a sniff, famously bathed only twice in his entire life. He preferred to mask his aromas with perfume, unaware he'd become a walking bottle of headache. Public bathhouses were briefly fashionable during the early Middle Ages, particularly in places influenced by Roman customs. People soaked, steamed, and sometimes socialized while scrubbing themselves with cheerful medieval loofahs, also known as handfuls of sand. But then the church grew nervous. Bathhouses, while full of water, were also full of licentious opportunity. Temptation conducted better when both parties were partially submerged. So gradually, public bathing fell out of grace. Cleanliness did not, as they say, linger near godliness any longer. Instead, people leaned into the funk. They codified cleanliness into odd little rituals. Washing hands and faces before meals, very sensible. Feet on Sundays, questionable. The backside? Well, it depended how urgent the day had been. Now, as twilight settles on your mind and history unfurls like a musty woolen blanket, consider the irony. Medieval folk feared water would kill them, while we now fear not drinking enough. But perhaps they were onto something, keeping all that moisture at bay. After all, their idea of a spa day was less cucumber slices over the eyes and more surviving another day in the same socks. Eventually, some clever souls began noticing that certain odors might correlate with disease. But let's not rush into that just yet. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. Let the scent of centuries fade now, like smoke from a long forgotten hearth. The night is deep and quiet, and tomorrow, another page in history, freshly unwashed and softly waiting. Imagine, if you will, the soft shuffle of muddy boots on uneven cobblestones, the low murmur of voices in a language that vaguely resembles English. If English had tripped over Latin, spilled wine all over its vowels, and then decided to write everything phonetically just to annoy future scholars. Welcome to a medieval village. It's mid-morning, which in the 14th century means the sun is up, the roosters are hoarse from overachieving, and everyone's already halfway through their day without, curiously, having bathed. But you see, that wasn't exactly laziness. It was more enthusiastic misunderstanding sprinkled with a dash of theological dread. Because for much of the medieval period, people weren't just avoiding baths, they were doing it with moral conviction. Public bathhouses had once been all the rage during the Roman Empire. A nice soak in warm communal water, a touch of olive oil massaging the skin, light gossip, maybe a gladiator-related update. But by the medieval period, the very idea of taking your clothes off in front of strangers had become suspicious, sinful even. And thanks to centuries of church-driven messaging, too much nakedness, especially in water, might tempt one to commit the very kind of sins that end with eternal fire. Hence, the logic went, better to be unwashed and spiritually safe than clean and eternally crispy. Also, they thought water could make you sick. Not dirty water. No. Just water in general. There was a prevailing belief that pores, once opened by warm bathing, became doors through which illness could stroll in like an invited guest. Your skin, to them, was less a barrier and more a heavy curtain. And bathing, why, that was like yanking the curtain open in midwinter, shouting, "Come on in, plague." Thus, the average medieval citizen approached water with the delicate caution one might use while handling an angry swan. You needed it to live, but you didn't want to anger it. Now, this isn't to say people never cleaned themselves. They did, sort of. There was the trusty linen cloth, used for what they called dry washing. It's like a very passionate pat-down with a rag. Areas requiring extra attention were sometimes dabbed with a vinegar-soaked cloth, because naturally, if something smells bad, let's just make it smell like salad dressing. Hair was brushed daily, partly because people genuinely enjoyed the grooming, and partly because brushes helped dislodge the occasional unwelcome lodger. Lice, nits, fleas, the whole medieval petting zoo. And for cleaning teeth, folks often chewed on mint and sage or rubbed charcoal and ashes on their gums. Effective? Questionable. Flavorful. Confusing. But refreshingly low carb. Of course, things were not the same for everyone. Nobles, those cloaked in velvet and arrogance, had access to private baths. Fancy wooden tubs lined with fabric, filled with warm water not once, not twice, but several times per year. They might even toss in rose petals or herbs, transforming themselves into a kind of herbal stew. A slightly pompous stew, but a sweet-smelling one nonetheless. Servants would haul buckets of steaming water up the stairs, one by one, heating them over a fire that took 3 hours to get going, and another 4 hours to regret kindling near the draperies. While noble persons bathed, they'd lounge, sip mead or spice wine, and complain about how hard it was to find decent musicians who knew how to play the oud properly. Meanwhile, peasants, the folks doing all the real work, were less concerned with aromatic herbs and more focused on not freezing to death. When they did bathe, it usually involved a chilly stream, a wooden bucket, or the rare moment when a nearby lake wasn't occupied by livestock, other people, or something unspeakably mysterious. And yet, somehow, all of them survived. Despite their dubious attitudes toward hygiene, they lived and thrived, albeit in clouds of their own personal aroma, trailing medieval perfume that smelled suspiciously like onions, sheep, and mild regret. But what if you were rich, stylish, and determined to stand apart from the fragrant throng? Was there a way to fake freshness in those musty days of yore? Indeed there was, in the most medieval way imaginable. Perfume, my friend. Or more accurately, a riot of scented herbs, curious concoctions, and potpourri pouches dangled proudly like olfactory shields. And that, dear dreamer, is where we'll float next, toward the curious tales of medieval deodorants, cologne habits, and why people carried tiny bouquets up their noses. Let us now drift down a mossy path, through a dew-dappled thicket of memory, into the bustling heart of a medieval town square, a place where chickens roamed with more confidence than some of the local nobles, and the air was generously seasoned with a fine cocktail of soot, raw onion, and mystery. Here, amid the clatter of wooden carts and barefoot children attempting proto-parkour over puddles of uncertain origin, we meet the medieval town dweller. Ah, the townie of yore, industrious, sturdy, and perhaps just a little fragrant. Their scent, shall we say, arrived before they did, and lingered long after they were gone. Most people today associate medieval stench with peasants, but let's not be too hasty. Nobility wasn't exactly walking around in clouds of lavender. No, my dear listener, everyone, with very few exceptions, was casually embracing a lifestyle we now describe as aromatically adventurous. Let's begin with the very buildings themselves, stuffed together like a clumsy game of timber and wattle Tetris. Upper floors jutted out over the street to save ground space, forming a kind of communal umbrella that mostly kept out the sun and all sense of personal boundaries. Good for whispering secrets, bad for drying laundry. And with no windows as we know them, just wooden shutters and the occasional romantic oiled parchment, it made for homes that were as dim and airless as a disgruntled root cellar. Add to this the delightful custom of tossing chamber pot contents directly into the street. Yes, from the upper floor window, with all the ceremony of emptying a teapot. There was even a helpful shout used to warn pedestrians below, something like "Gardez l'eau," which means "watch out for the water" in French. Linguists believe this phrase may have evolved into the word "loo," a fitting homage considering the trajectory of most bodily fluids back then. Waste disposal was, shall we say, rudimentary. Streets were not swept so much as hoped for. If it rained, perhaps Mother Nature would carry off the worst of it. If it didn't, best wear sturdy boots and cultivate a strong sense of detachment. And then, there were the livestock. Oh yes, cows, pigs, chickens, occasionally an ambitious goose. They all served a civic role. Not only were they essential to medieval diets, but they also acted as unofficial street cleaners. Pigs especially. These tusky troopers would root through muck, leftovers, and sometimes more ambiguous organic matter, like little piggy sanitation workers. Are you imagining all that in the warm summer sun now? Perhaps the merchants are selling fresh fish from barrels stored overnight in the open air, united in aromatic harmony with the blacksmith's smoking forge and the tanner's yard, curing hides with the quaint use of fermented dog urine. Yes, dog urine. It has many talents, you know. In the medieval world, you didn't waste anything, including pungent canine contributions. And yet, here's the wonder. This was normal, entirely ordinary. People were nose blind to it all. Much like how you can't smell your own house until someone else walks in and says, "Ah, smells like soup and existential dread in here." The medieval olfactory nerve simply adjusted. This was the world. It smelled like life, death, and a bit of boiled cabbage. It's important to remember, too, that water wasn't always trusted. Drinking it could be riskier than downing a random potion from an unlabeled bottle. Beer and wine were the safer option. An excellent explanation for why half the population was mildly tipsy from breakfast onward. And if you can't smell your neighbour, perhaps it's because you've had 2 ales and a shot of medieval courage already. As twilight falls on our little street, and the last glimmers of daylight give everything a shadowy kindness, the town settles in. Candles flicker from behind wooden shutters. A donkey brays something foul-tempered into the dusk. Somewhere, someone is softly cursing about stepping in something unfortunate. All is as it should be. But now that we've had our cozy stroll through the marketplace of mildew and mystery, let us quietly step through the creaking doors of a less explored wonder, the medieval bathhouse. For yes, they existed. And while they offered warm water and whispered dreams of cleanliness, they were a little more complicated than one might hope. As the sun dipped behind the mossy thatch of medieval rooftops, the evening air was thick with the scent of hearth-fire smoke and something less poetic. You see, by the time we reached the 14th century, cleanliness had firmly settled into the realm of theoretical virtues, like humility or reading Latin. In much of Europe, the average person bathed roughly as often as the local blacksmith took a nap. Seldom, with low enthusiasm, and usually under duress. But before we point fingers, preferably not with bare hands, let's remember that it wasn't always this way. Once upon a slightly less grimy time, Roman bathhouses had dotted the landscape like luxurious medieval Starbucks. Public bathing was a thing of architectural beauty and communal gossip. Sandals off, robes optional, and rumours hotter than the steam room. But alas, the Romans fell, as empires tend to do when they spend too much time debating over marble pillows and not enough defending their borders. With their departure, Europe gradually forgot some of its more sophisticated personal habits, like how to construct aqueducts or use soap correctly. Soap. Ah yes, the fragrant cornerstone of civilization. Except it wasn't all that fragrant yet. Medieval soap, especially in the earlier centuries, was a far cry from your lavender and goat milk artisanal dream. It was more like a meaty cube of tragedy. Lye made from ashes, mixed with rendered animal fat, and stirred together until it could remove both filth and several layers of dignity. It did clean, technically, but one couldn't use it without acquiring the scent of boiled bacon that had gone through something traumatic. Oddly enough, bathing itself was not entirely off the medieval radar. In fact, public bathhouses made something of a comeback during the High Middle Ages, particularly in places like Paris, Cologne, and London. These bathhouses, however, were equal parts spa and social experiment. Picture a wooden tub filled with lukewarm water that had already hosted 3 to 5 other enthusiastic bathers. Add candles, a touch of herbal oil, maybe a wandering lute player if you were lucky, and voila, a medieval bath night. For couples, this could be romantic, unless, of course, They realized halfway through that they were accidentally sharing the tub with Gertrude, the baker's apprentice, who had mistaken it for a sourdough fermentation barrel. It gets better. These bathhouses became so popular that they acquired a reputation beyond just cleanliness. The German word for them, Badstube, is delightfully vague. It can mean bathhouse or, with just a knowing nod, a brothel, which raises the age-old question, were medieval people getting clean or getting busy? Sometimes both, in the same session, possibly with the same bar of soap. The line between relaxation and scandal was slipperier than the wooden floorboards after a 2-for-1 bath night. Now, for those who preferred a more modest approach, or couldn't afford a bath with a harpist and a questionable wink, there were other options. Dry cloths, for instance. Some folks simply wiped themselves down with linen, as if dusting off furniture, until it seemed like maybe they'd bathed recently. Perfume sachets were also popular. These little bags of herbs were hung around necks or sewn into clothing, as if bath and body works had been outsourced to a monastery. One particularly ambitious method, practiced by the more pious or paranoid, was sweat bathing. This involved wrapping oneself in thick wool and sitting near a fire, producing a level of perspiration that could delude the senses into believing a deep cleanse had occurred. It hadn't, but many dried off after these sessions with a look of grim satisfaction, as if they'd accomplished something honourable. And lo, in some cosmic scale of effort to hygiene ratio, perhaps they had. Still, cleanliness remained, for many, a spiritual pursuit more than a hygienic one. The body was temporary. The soul was forever. So if your body smelled like a compost heap dipped in mild despair, well, that was just your way of rejecting worldly vanity. Of course, vanity or not, lice and fleas offered no such theological patience. They adored the unwashed and moved in en masse, forming thriving civilizations of their own amidst unlaundered tunics and scraggly beards. But grooming, dear listener, was its own peculiar art, and the medieval answer to lice, well, let's just say it, involved more candles than you'd expect, but that we'll gently explore, right after a bit more rest. Let us drift now to the cobbled streets of a medieval village, somewhere between the misty heather of northern England and the vague scent of boiled cabbage. It is early morning, and the sun rises as if by accident, reluctantly casting pale gold over thatched rooftops and wooden shutters that creak like gossipy old uncles. Somewhere, a rooster announces dawn with his gravelly warble, having clearly smoked something in a past life. Now, if you were fortunate, or perhaps unfortunate enough, to be alive at this particular time, you would likely begin your day by not bathing. Not out of laziness or rebellion, mind you, but because most people genuinely believed that bathing was dangerous. Yes, truly. Doctors, or the people who merely owned pointy hats and unconvincingly pretended to be doctors, warned that immersing the body in water would open the pores and allow illness to enter, like an uninvited raccoon wandering into your bloodstream. This notion, as baffling as it may sound to our 21st century sensibilities, carried great weight. In their defense, people were trying. Soap existed, technically, though it was more of an abrasive paste that smelled like if pine had been offended and then boiled out of spite. A mix of animal fat and lye, early soap was not so much a fragrance experience as a medieval dare. Water, too, presented issues. Clean water sources were elusive, especially in bustling towns where wells were essentially communal cauldrons of optimistic bacteria. Many villagers preferred ale or weak beer for drinking, brushing teeth, if they had teeth, or simply as a refreshing facial mist. Ale possessed the dual benefit of relative safety and light inebriation, which helped one contend with the general ambience of medieval life, including the pervasive, lingering sourness of everything. Bathhouses did exist, of course. In earlier centuries, public bathing had been semi-respectable, even fashionable. Men and women bathed across from each other, chatting merrily, splashing about in convivial if slightly scandalous harmony. But fashions change. Like all things in decline, cleanliness fell out of vogue somewhere between the bubonic plague and the Protestant Reformation. And so, by the time we find ourselves in the heart of the Middle Ages, the average European was washing less frequently than a modern cat. Instead, they masked body odor with a variety of fragrant strategies. One involved dangling pomanders, small, scented orbs, inside their clothing. These might be filled with cloves, rose petals, or whatever herbs hadn't already been used to season last night's watery stew. Nobility, ever invested in maintaining the illusion of effortlessness, would commission elaborate sachets to tuck in their sleeves and undergarments. It added an extra layer of mystery to courtship. Did Lady Beatrice truly favour you? Or was it merely that you smelled less appalling than the suitor who arrived reeking of turnips and latent feudal anxiety? Beyond perfume and prayer, another defence against odour was clearly defined personal space. Though let's not pretend social distancing was a guiding virtue. If someone smelled worse than you simply edged slightly away and pretended to study the tapestry. This subtle dance of olfactory diplomacy defined much of medieval social hierarchy. Whoever could afford to smell tolerable often ruled the room. Interestingly, monks, champions of austerity, chant, and early bedtime, sometimes bathed more than most, owing to the Roman traditions preserved in certain monasteries. Yet even their habits were tempered with caution. Baths were often taken lukewarm and sparsely, lest the devil take up residence in one's follicles. In cities, municipal regulations attempting to deal with the stench were drafted with sincere optimism and minimal success. Laws mandated street cleaning, controlled where slaughterhouses could be built, not always obeyed, and even sought to restrict the disposal of urine and other bodily cheerfulness into the roads. Spoiler, it still happened, frequently, often from an upper story window. And thus, the average nose in medieval times was not just accustomed to the bouquet of the era. It had evolved into a sort of coping mechanism. People filtered odours like sommeliers of the distasteful. A good nose could distinguish between barnyard with a hint of yesterday's fish and angry goat mingled with cousin's boots. But one mustn't think ill of them. After all, they were simply doing the best they could in a world where smell was less a danger and more a way of life. A constant hum in the background, like a lute plucked one note too long. And as you settle back into your blankets now, tucked safely in your fresh laundered sheets, take comfort in knowing that the worst medieval body odour was likely accompanied by a very polite, "My apologies, good sir," and perhaps a sachet slipped under the arm as a goodwill gesture, or an act of self-defense. Just beyond the next crooked lane of this dream village, we'll discover what passed for dental hygiene in the days when kisses were both romantic and slightly hazardous. Inside the stone walls of medieval manors, nestled between drafty hallways and poorly lit hearths, lived a curious companion to every nobleman and peasant alike: the chamber pot. Yes, dear listener, that noble bucket of dreams tucked discreetly beneath bedsides and behind curtains. It may not sparkle like a knight's visor or inspire songs like a lute, but this humble vessel was a daily and nightly necessity. in a world where the bathroom was more of a theory than a place. Let us linger, comfortably and from a distance, on the habits of the medieval household. Imagine the thick wooden floorboards and the sheep wool stuffed mattress atop a creaky bed. There's a fire flickering faintly in one corner, sluggishly battling the chill. And beneath that very bed lies a ceramic sentinel, the chamber pot, ready for action should nature call during the witching hour. Using the chamber pot was not a privilege of the elite. Everyone from castle lords to village cobblers relied on one. Toilets, as we know them, sounded like sorcery to most medieval ears. Instead, people squatted with resignation and a vague hope that no one would enter the room mid-process. Modesty was important, or at the very least, preferable. And what did they do with the contents, you wonder? Surely there was a grand sanitation system managed by caped professionals with noble titles like Duke of Disposal. Alas, not quite. The average cities and towns lacked anything resembling a sewer. In many places, especially before the advent of more centralized waste systems, it was considered perfectly acceptable, normal even, to empty one's chamber pot directly into the street, preferably shouted with due warning, like a herald announcing, "Guard thy heads." Some used the more poetic gardez-vous, derived from the French phrase "prenez garde à l'eau," watch out for the water. Although, let's be honest, it was not water. That's right. Medieval mornings didn't just begin with the crowing of roosters. They began with cautious steps, slippery cobbles, and the scent of yesterday's decisions. Shoes, like most things, were ill-prepared for this aromatic minefield, but chamber pots were merely the at-home solution. If one found themselves traveling or out and about, nature became the de facto restroom. Behind a bush, down an alley, behind a cart of turnips, any secluded nook would do. Privacy was a concept granted only by opportunity. In castles, one might think the nobility had it better. And they did, relatively speaking. Some castles featured a garderobe, an early form of a toilet. It was a private room suspended over the outer wall, with a hole through which waste fell. You might be thinking, that sounds decent. Well, no. The waste simply plopped down the side of the structure, practically a guided tour of gravity, where it collected at the base, forming what was politely referred to as a cesspit, which, despite sounding vaguely cute, was the absolute opposite of cute. Garderobes often doubled as closets for clothes, not because medieval people enjoyed mysterious stains, but because it was believed that the ammonia in the waste fumes helped repel moths. Yes. They hung their lovely woolen dresses and thick velvet cloaks in little rooms filled with smells that would bring a nostalgic tear to a dung beetle's eye. This wasn't a cleaning method, of course, just a mildly effective, if odor-prone, pest control strategy. City dwellers, meanwhile, sometimes shared communal outhouses or privies. Privy, meaning both, to know something secret, and, in this case, a place you quietly expected no one would follow you into. These public restrooms were hardly private, poorly maintained, and worryingly close to wells and water sources. If you're wondering how people avoided diseases, well, they often didn't. These unsanitary arrangements were part of daily life. Which brings us back to our main mystery, the unmistakable medieval aroma. When waste is part of the landscape, the olfactory consequences are inevitable. From overflowing chamber pots to garderobes dangling like digestive balconies, personal hygiene didn't stand a chance. Still, there was a certain resilience in their ways, a gritty acceptance. People went about their lives, crafting, trading, marrying, praying, enduring, while sidewalks and breezes carried gentle reminders of shared humanity. In every puff of wind, a touch of ode to Middle Ages. But let's not dwell too long on this. Pull the covers up snugly and breathe deeply of imaginary fresher air. For even in this rather fragrant world, there was room for invention. Curious contraptions would be dreamt up, questioning whether we really needed to keep tossing things onto the street. And somewhere, just beyond our dozing thoughts, monks were on the move, quiet, deliberate, and surprisingly responsible when it came to being clean. Well, some of them. But that, as always, is a tale for another stretch of quiet night. As we drift into the candle-lit heart of the Middle Ages, let us float gently towards one of history's most misunderstood hotspots of hygiene, or more precisely, the lack thereof, the medieval kitchen. Now, don't let your imagination whisk you away to rustic charm and delicious stews gently burbling in copper pots. No. The medieval kitchen was less Martha Stewart and more vaguely on fire. At the core of any half-decent castle or manor house was the kitchen, a smoky sanctum where smells congregated like guests who overstayed their welcome. Picture enormous hearths constantly ablaze, like the medieval version of a 24/7 diner that only served some sort of meat, hopefully. The chefs, if one is generous with such a title, grappled with spit-roasted animals, brass cauldrons bubbling with mystery servings, and smoke thick enough to flavour the soup through sheer atmospheric pervasiveness. The stench, dear dreamer, was not limited to burnt onions and questionable pheasant, because while kitchen staff were busy feeding nobles, hygiene was gently waved at from a distance. Picture butchers in various levels of desperation, chopping flesh on the same wooden slabs where yesterday's goo still lingered, in spirit and droppings. Rats considered the kitchen their social club, and fleas took residence in the bread like it was rent-controlled. For the cooks themselves, bathing was as rare as a meat pie, without surprise. Clergy occasionally whispered, with noticeable concern, that too much washing could seduce the body into impurity. That's correct. Cleanliness was considered a gateway behavior. Naturally, kitchen staff adapted by layering the same tunics day after day, until they developed a patina rivaling a fine cheese rind. The smell. Imagine old mutton left on a windowsill, kissed by indoor smoke and the occasional beeswax candle. Then imagine this became a person. But one must not forget the menu items themselves, for they carried their own bouquet of aromas. Fish, for example, frequently arrived inland after days of transport under only the lightest salt garnish and not nearly enough divine intervention. The result? A perfume of the sea and also the grave. Meat, if you were lucky enough to afford old cow or might be rabbit, was often preserved through salting or drying, methods that perhaps added longevity but also transformed flavour into something between leather and revenge. Add to this the liberal use of spices, pepper, cloves, cinnamon, not to elevate taste as much as to distract from whatever the taste actually was underneath. A medieval stew was more mystery novel than meal. Each bite prompted questions. What animal is this? Why is it crunchy? Should it be fizzing? And yet, despite all this olfactory chaos, the kitchen was the cheerful heart of many households. For in a world of body odour, spoiled trout, and mildly threatening cheese, warmth and the promise of slightly edible turnip stew wrapped around people like a quilt. The kitchen was noisy, yes, and pungent, doubly yes, but it smelled like life. Sort of. Now, to be fair, not all was completely grim. Some cooks, mostly in monasteries or wealthy households, did attempt cleanliness, Monks had rules about washing ladles between uses, though those uses often involved both stew and medicine, so results may have varied. And some clever cooks began to suspect that trimming mold off bread didn't actually remove the mold. One early sign of scientific hygiene, or simply someone tired of the bread tasting like it had thoughts. Even herbs had a dual role, used in cooking and occasionally thrown on floors to mask whatever else was there. Thyme underfoot wasn't just aromatic, it was a medieval air freshener, crushed beneath the stomping boots of squires and soot-streaked cooks alike. So as the fire cracks, the pot hums, and a questionable duck roasts slowly above glowing coals, picture a room scented with smoke, sweat, thyme, and the haunting presence of yesterday's trout. A place fragrant not with perfume, but perseverance. A scent that said, "We're doing our best while the plumbing is still several centuries away. Now, drift with me from the kitchen's eternal haze and step lightly across the solar-heated flagstones toward a place far less appetizing, the medieval latrine." For though kitchens served the senses, privies truly tested them. You might assume that the medieval person's scent profile was mostly unchanged day to day. Some blend of goat, firewood, bread crust, damp wool, and existential dread. But oh no, dear dreamer, there were elaborate social rules and customs around cleanliness, within limits. When you don't have daily access to hot baths, you find ways to declare that you simply don't need them. And that's where we must drift into the curious world of medieval bathing. Or more accurately, avoiding it in just enough style to not be chased out of church. Now first, let's set the stage. A medieval bath was not your private porcelain sanctuary with scented candles and a Bluetooth speaker murmuring Enya. No, it was more like a lukewarm soup of humanity. Public bathhouses, especially in cities, were common hubs where people soaked their worries, and occasionally their neighbours, in large shared tubs. These establishments were not only places to get you marginally cleaner, but also to socialise, gossip, and, how shall we put this, indulge in extracurricular fellowship. Indeed, bathhouses had something steamy about them, and not just from the hot water. Many gradually gained reputations for being places where bathing and brothling got uncomfortably cozy. That spicy association eventually led to considerable churchy eyebrow raising, and the "maybe just don't bathe unless you must" school of hygiene. After all, nothing good, they insisted, ever happened near hot water and naked elbows. But back in slightly earlier times, say the 12th century, bathing was still relatively fashionable among those who could afford their own tub or attend a bathhouse with a strong door and weak moral code. Noble households often had wooden tubs dragged before the hearth, and servants would trudge in with steaming pails of water, precariously balanced and likely sweating more than the poor soul they were about to ladle. The bather would lower themselves into the shallow water where the temperature was either glacial pond or help, I'm being confitted. Herbs were sometimes added for scent or spiritual protection. Lavender for soothing skin, rosemary for remembering that you were supposed to feel clean, and wormwood for reasons still debated by sleepy historians. But make no mistake, bathing was usually an ordeal. No plumbing, no drainage, and once the water cooled and sullied, well, that was that. Bathing at home wasn't just a hassle, it was mildly dangerous. Learned men of the age, the ones who wore their beards like existential paragraphs, warned that warm water opened the pores, which made a body vulnerable to evil humours or disease-bearing miasmas floating free in the air. This, of course, is nonsense, But when you don't know about bacteria and your thermometer is a goose feather filled with guesswork, perhaps cautious ignorance makes perfect sense. So people bathed less and less, and to replace soap and water, they relied on the mystical art of scent camouflage. Enter the pomander, a small metal container filled with aromatic herbs, spices and dried flowers, often carried or hung from belts to form the medieval equivalent of a portable air freshener. The wealthy would also sew sweet herbs into their clothing, carry nosegays, and dab themselves in oils that combined to make them smell, not better necessarily, but busier, like someone had tried. One particularly inventive bishop declared that washing one's hands was appropriate if they were noticeably filthy, but bathing the entire body was vain and possibly heretical. This sentiment snowballed into centuries of hesitant hygiene. There were entire communities that considered dirt to be a sign of piety, humility, and divine neglect. Mind you, this wasn't universal. In Muslim Spain, for example, public bathhouses were thriving, refined institutions with hot and cold rooms, massages and steam, a far cry from the drafty European vision of the bath as a sort of contagious temptation with plumbing. The contrast is striking. In Cordoba, you could enjoy a civilized soak with friends and mint tea. In most of France, you were lucky not to be excommunicated for rinsing too enthusiastically. Still, now and then, someone brave would push back against the prevailing tide of grime. Eleanor of Aquitaine, for instance, had a bathhouse installed in her palace and demanded fresh linens daily. Scandalous, and yet appealing, though the washerwomen doing all that scrubbing may have had a few quiet thoughts about Eleanor's enthusiasm. So the frequency of bathing in medieval Europe became a kind of social weather, changing based on century, region, religion, and availability of buckets. What never changed, however, was the booming business of pretending one didn't need a bath. Whether you hid behind perfume, prayer, or the medieval version of "I'm just built different," clean was a relative state, and a very rare one at that. And now, let's drift gently onward, toward the fine art of medieval laundry, where water is feared, soap is optional, and your shirt might just stand up on its own and walk away. Somewhere near the long, lingering edge of twilight, when the sky over 12th century Europe was washed in a dim watercolor of stars and wood smoke, a curious scent traveled quietly through the towns and villages. It was the gentle, persistent odor of centuries gone without deodorant. But among all the human effluvia, sweaty linen, unwashed armor, the occasional fermented onion, there was one source of medieval musk that reigned supreme in both pungency and prestige: the textile industry. Yes, my sleepy scholar, the very fabric of medieval fashion came with more than just questionable tailoring. It came with a distinct bouquet. Let us cozy up beside the dye vats and spinning wheels now, and explore how making clothes in the Middle Ages made everyone, quite literally, reek of the effort. You see, producing clothes wasn't just a matter of slipping into something comfortable. It was a glorious, nose-wrinkling symphony of sheep, sweat, and stewing liquids, particularly the making of wool, which was the polyester of medieval days, only considerably warmer and about 7 times smellier. Wool had to be cleaned, of course, but in an age before OxyClean and lemon-scented detergent pods, the cleansing process involved fullers, people whose profession revolved around stomping on soggy bundles of cloth soaked in, well, fermented urine. Yes, urine. Human urine collected in barrels and politely referred to as chamber lye. This sour-smelling solution was prized for its ammonia content, which helped scour grease from raw wool. If you're wondering how it was applied, picture several grown adults rhythmically dancing atop cloth in vats of wee. A charmingly toe-curling visual, isn't it? These fullers, bless their nostrils, earned their keep by ensuring medieval townspeople had cloaks, tunics, and hose that were less sheepish and more presentable. Still, the scent of their labour followed them like a loyal dog. And it wasn't just the fullers who carried it. When the cloth was dried, dyed, and woven into garments, some traces of its fragrant journey lingered. The faintest bouquet of barnyard water might rise as someone walked by in their best woolen coat. And all of this before anyone had even considered applying a single perfumed oil. Dyeing, too, was its own smelly science. Colour wasn't simply squeezed from a paint tube. Deep hues were extracted from nature at significant cost to nostrils and dignity. Want a nice burgundy? Fantastic. It comes from soaked madder root. A rich blue? Try fermented woad leaves, which required long periods of rotting in piss-like stews that could easily qualify as weapons-grade stench. Worm guts, pulverized insects, boiled bark. The woods were alive with colour and, unfortunately, the smell to match. But perhaps one of the boldest olfactory adventures came from the people who wore these lovingly urinated upon clothes. Tanners. These were the folks who turned animal hides into leather, adding a bit of snappy grace to a knight's girdle or a monk's sandals. Tanning was a veritable opera of stink. Flesh had to be scraped with spoons. Hides were stroked lovingly, if legally questionably, inside pits filled with dog dung, lime, and fermented animal brains. Yes, brains. Don't worry. It was all part of the softening process, only slightly less popular than your bath bombs today. Tanners were so famously fragrant that most towns forced them to live on the outskirts, downstream from everyone else. The final product may have been sleek, brown, and highly waterproof, but any romance one might have felt for their leather belt was tempered by the knowledge it had journeyed through vats of canine droppings. And yet, these were the tools of industry, the building blocks of civility. In a time without Netflix, synthetic fragrances, or even a decent loofah, folks had to rely on the natural world and its most pungent offerings. So while noblemen dined in velvet robes and crofters tightened their woolen scarves, each movement released a whisper of history, a soft, stinging perfume born not in a bottle, but in barrels, sentient boots, and the determined elbow grease of the stinky, sturdy working class. Clothing, after all, wasn't just a statement. It was a scent trail, one that wafted through markets, castles, and pilgrimage roads alike, reminding everyone that beauty and social status came at an olfactory price. And as the medieval breeze carried these earthy traces beneath a patchwork sky, a new question began to rise among the dreamers and wanderers. If these were the smells of getting dressed, what, oh what, did they use as soap? But that, patient listener, is a tale awaiting just around the bend in our foggy, fragrant road. Long before soap operas and scented candles, there was something far more pungent wafting through the air of medieval streets. And it wasn't the aroma of fresh-baked baguettes. No, it was the warm, wet bouquet of humanity itself. And nowhere did this complex fragrance mature more fervently than in the clothing of medieval folk. To understand why everyone smelled as if they'd been seasoned for days and roasted over a peat fire, we must first examine the essentials of medieval fashion. Picture it: a woolen tunic clinging faithfully to your torso through the seasons. Summer, pestilence, and another summer. These garments were not washed often, or at all. Most people owned just one or two outfits, and outfit rotation wasn't a thing, unless you counted turning the same shirt inside out and pretending it was different. Now, wool is a noble material, warm, durable, and delightfully itchy. But when combined with sweat, dirt, and the occasional chamber pot mishap, it becomes less lofty shepherdess in the hills of Wales and more unidentified dampness. Linen, slightly more luxurious, but still a fabric of the people, was used for undergarments, the medieval version of underwear. Theoretically, these could be washed more often. Suspiciously, they weren't. Laundry was unnecessarily complicated. You needed water, heat, a tedious amount of scrubbing, and a general sense of optimism, all of which were in short supply, unless you lived near a river and didn't mind losing a finger to a slippery rock. So when the clothes began to walk into rooms uninvited, what did medieval people do? Well, quite a few things, most of which would make a modern dermatologist weep. Instead of washing themselves or their outfits, many people resorted to simply adding more layers. Yes, like a scented candle trying to mask the smell of a roast chicken. They wrapped silk or fur over their already well-ripened attire. The result? A delightful compression of bodily aromas, aged like a fine cheese from which one should maintain a respectful distance. And speaking of fur, there is no smell quite like damp. Animal pelts in an unventilated hall warmed by a fireplace, and 1,000 years of shared regret. Nobles loved furs for their softness, status, and complete inability to not smell like a wet forest creature after a sleet storm. In royal households, perfumes helped mask the situation somewhat. Rose water, lavender oil, and even vinegar were popular attempts at olfactory diplomacy. Folk would dab these onto their linens or soak sachets of herbs and carry them about like medieval Glade plugins. Of course, when the human at the center of it all hadn't bathed in a month, no amount of rosemary was going to reinvent them. Which brings us to the cloak. Oh, the cloak. Versatile, majestic, and terrific at trapping every particle of air you've ever breathed. It swirled dramatically through castle corridors, but also quietly fermented behind closed doors. There were capes that had seen the same feast, battlefield, and lice colony, yet still weren't considered dirty until they became visibly sentient. Don't get me wrong, some people tried. They beat their garments with sticks by the river, dragged them through ash and lye, and scrubbed them against washboards that looked suspiciously like medieval torture devices. But even if the clothes came out cleaner, the river likely didn't. Social responsibility wasn't yet a thing, so most laundry events simply led to downstream ill will and perplexed fish. And so, they coexisted, man, tunic, and smell. Sometimes nobility had multiple outfits, and sometimes they passed them down generations until the original scent had calcified into legend. But what about shoes, you ask? A delightfully musty tale awaits. Footwear in medieval times was as organic as it gets, mostly leather, stitched by hand, often unlined and inexplicably shared between siblings. They would absorb the unique essence of each foot like a fine wine absorbing the barrel, creating a veritable bouquet of moisture and memories. As the stars rise overhead and the wind carries stories through ancient forests, imagine slipping into a woolen chemise, worn soft over 5 winters, and stepping outside just long enough to remember that soap is indeed a miracle of modern civilization. But should you desire relief from the relentless whiff of history, well, in the next stretch of moonlight, we shall quietly shuffle into the equally fragrant world of medieval dentistry. Ah yes, because mouths too have secrets. The mood inside a medieval kitchen was a symphony of firecrackles, bubbling stews, and the occasional loud squawk from an uncooperative goose. You might think the hearth, the very soul of a household, would also be the sanctuary of cleanliness. Ah, but no. The medieval kitchen was more of a chaotic olfactory adventure, a blend of boiling meats, old garlic, soot, and questionable fish decisions left unrefrigerated for just a few centuries too long. But let us zoom in, not on what was being cooked, but rather who was doing the cooking, and more importantly, how often they had seen soap in their lives. Cooks in a medieval household were often undervalued heroes of both sustenance and scent sabotage. These culinary magicians, armed with ladles and courage, were tasked with preparing meals in conditions that would make a modern health inspector faint into their clipboard. Hygiene standards were loosely interpreted, shall we say. A cook might spend the morning gutting a fish, plucking a pheasant, and stuffing a pie with meat of uncertain vintage, all without changing aprons. The result was less Michelin star and more medicament stat. Add to that the fact that water, a thing we now imagine gushing from steel spouts in convenient rooms, was in those days a thing you walked a muddy mile for, carried home in a wooden bucket, and then guarded like dragon treasure. So washing hands and tools in between handling raw meat and wiping your nose, an optional bonus if at all. Some higher tier households had more structured approaches to cleanliness. Wealthier kitchens employed a position known as the scullion, which sounds like a delicate bird, but was actually a very underappreciated human being, tasked with cleaning pots, pans, and, on occasion, the floor, with what historians gently describe as rudimentary effort. Scullions were almost always young boys or the absolute bottom, both socially and literally, of the domestic staff. Imagine being knee-deep in grease and onion skins while someone yells at you to scrub a cauldron used for pickled eel pudding. Not exactly the origin story of a spa influencer. Now, as for the actual food, it's worth noting that strong-smelling ingredients were not only culinary choices, they were strategic olfactory disguises. Garlic, onions, leeks, and an entire medieval spice rack of coriander, cumin, and even imported cinnamon served the dual purpose of flavoring food and concealing the fact that the meat may have been taking its final journey to the afterlife days ago. In castles, things could get lavish, but not necessarily cleaner. During banquets, dozens of dishes were paraded out one after another, and one might assume that extensive staff and ritual would keep things pristine. But with no refrigeration, little cross-contamination awareness, and what we might kindly refer to as rustic notions of food storage, these grand feasts were as much an assault on the senses as they were on the intestines. And yet, despite all this, the medieval kitchen became a hearth around which life hovered. It was warm, it was filled with action, and yes, sometimes it smelled like heaven wrapped in garlic, and other times like a boiled boot. But this was often the beating heart of the home. Alongside the soup pots and sizzling meats lived the company of cats, who were semi-official members of the cleaning crew. Not in the hygiene department, mind you, heavens no, but in their capacity as anti-rat agents. They prowled the kitchen, shadows like adorable little crime lords, making deals with the cooks for scraps in return for keeping the rodent population down. Whether or not they succeeded is debatable, but the intent was pure. Ish. Of course, the concept of clean as you go had not yet been invented, and a lot of the clean in question tended to involve more scraping than scrubbing. Knives wiped on aprons, hands wiped on trousers, and spoons licked and returned to use. It was a time before the invention of the wet wipe. A dark age indeed, but lest we get too smug, with our antibacterial gels and dishwasher-safe cutting boards, remember this: some of these medieval meals, created under spectacularly questionable conditions, went on to define culinary traditions that still grace our tables today. Pottage, stews, spit-roasted meats, all born in smoky, fragrant kitchens where soap was mythological and aprons were multi-purpose cloaks of flavour. And speaking of roasting things near open flames, there's another place where smells, both holy and havoc-wreaking, collected in layers like the soot on a monastery wall. A place where incense isn't just spiritual, it's downright necessary. Let's wander now, in hush and reverence, toward the medieval church. As the moon draped its silver shawl across thatched rooftops and sleepy sheep curled into themselves out in the fog-kissed fields, let us drift now into one of the most curiously overlooked corners of medieval hygiene, the matter of bed linens. Yes, dear dreamer, sheets, or rather, the utter absence of them for most folks. While today we moan about thread counts and Egyptian cotton, your average medieval peasant was thrilled to simply have a straw mattress that didn't poke through with surprise thistles or the occasional mouse. A luxury bed was a pile of hay that hadn't hosted a chicken recently. Nobles, of course, had proper bedding. We use that word loosely. A mattress might consist of a sack crammed with pea straw or feathers laid atop ropes stretched across a frame, giving rise, quite literally, to the phrase "sleep tight," as loose ropes made for saggy slumber. Every few weeks, servants were tasked with tightening the ropes underneath, often accompanied by much grumbling and the onset of chronic lower back pain. Blankets were woolen, scratchy, and slightly pungent, much like the sheep they once enveloped. And as for sheets, linen sheets were a prized possession, handed down with an air of reverence usually reserved for religious relics or prized goats. Linen was hard to produce, difficult to clean, and worse yet, prone to yellowing in the damp draughts of castle halls. Washing bedding? Well, doesn't that sound ambitious? A well-off household might wash their sheets twice a year. Peasants might never wash theirs ever, especially because they didn't have any to begin with. But now, lean in a little closer as I whisper a word that shook medieval minds rigid with propriety: undergarments. Contrary to lazy misconceptions, medieval people did, in fact, have underwear, at least for the bottom half. Linen brays for men, a sort of roomy shorts-meet diaper arrangement, were tied around the waist with a cord and could be hitchhiked up or down depending on one's business priorities. Women had long shirts or shifts made of similar linen, worn under their outer gowns. These clothes were, interestingly, washed more regularly than other garments because they were worn next to the skin. And after all, even medieval folks had their limits. But the line between pajamas and daywear was blurred to the extent that bedtime rarely warranted an outfit change. You simply removed your outermost layers, preserved modesty with your shift, and rolled into your lumpy, hay-poking bed. Sleepwear fashion was not exactly trending. There were no teddy bear patterns, no plaid flannel sets, just the soft crinkle of worn linen and the warm breath of livestock nearby. Yes, many people, especially in rural households, slept in the same room as animals for warmth, economy, and, unfortunately, odor coordination. A snoring pig makes for a surprising lullaby, and the occasional escaped chicken could startle one awake with a bedside peck. It was a deeply aromatic experience. Think, odor hooves with earthy undertones and just a hint of damp straw. Now, candles were precious, so the moment the sun dropped, households fell into darkness like a heavy curtain. Lamp oil was expensive and largely reserved for those prone to nighttime plotting or bookkeeping. The average person took their cues from the stars and simply slid into slumber shortly after nightfall. Sleep came in two acts then, a first sleep and second sleep, with a wakeful interval in the middle that people often used for prayer, stoking the hearth, or, depending on proximity to another human, modest canoodling. And though baths were infrequent and teeth cleaning amounted to chewing an herb and hoping for the best, people clung to whatever rituals of cleanliness they could afford. Their nightwear might smell of lavenders hung in the room, a hopeful defense against fleas, bedbugs, and the general stink of humanity. Shoes were off, feet were, ideally, scrubbed, or at least wiped on the rushes strewn about the floor, and a whispered prayer might be offered to St. Gertrude, patron of travellers, insomniacs, and, charmingly enough, cats. And speaking of beasts, bed sharing was not limited to pigs and chickens. Entire families, parents, children, and the occasional grandparent, often bunked together in a single bed, arranged like medieval Tetris, all limbs and elbows, cocooned for warmth. This did, tragically, make midnight trips to relieve oneself a heroic journey of limb climbing and chamber pot navigation. So as you rest your head tonight on a pillow that's hopefully not stuffed with sawdust and remorse, remember that bedtime in the Middle Ages was its own strange symphony, a creaking rope, a snoring cow, the scratch of a flea, and the slow, cozy exhale of people who knew they had survived another day. Tomorrow, we shall travel to the steamy, or not so steamy, world of medieval public bathhouses, where gossip, naked elbows, and herbal baths once collided in the most surprising of ways. Sleepy winds once drifted through the stone alleyways of medieval cities, weaving between straw-thatched roofs and clattering market stalls, carrying the sweet, unfortunate perfume of humanity's earliest flirtations with urban living. And here, nestled deep within the heart of those bustling medieval towns, was an institution both noble and nose-wrinkling: the medieval barber surgeon. Now, before you picture a neat barber shop with striped poles and cheery banter over a close shave, let us dim the lights of imagination and adjust our expectations. A medieval barber surgeon was less the dandy you'd trust with your sideburns, and more the enterprising operator who'd willingly cut your hair and your broken leg, sometimes right after each other. The famous red and white barber's pole, still spinning outside barbershops today, actually has a delightfully unnerving origin. The red once symbolized blood, the white for bandages, and the pole itself. It represented the wooden rod you clutched tightly, while the barber surgeon thoughtfully bled you with leeches or a tiny blade. How quaint. Bloodletting, you see, was the medieval version of a wellness regimen. Feeling sluggish? Best to drain a pint or two. Suffering from bad dreams? Perhaps your humours are unbalanced. Bring the leeches. Headache, toothache, general air of melancholy. Let's open a vein and see what happens. If you were lucky, the barber surgeon rubbed garlic over the wound after, presumably for its antimicrobial qualities and not to keep any vampire clients at bay. Of course, these humble heroes weren't just wielding leeches and razors. Barber surgeons often performed minor surgical procedures such as lancing boils, setting bones, and removing arrows on particularly exciting Tuesdays. But they were also expected to be masters of hair and beard, delivering a fresh trim before, during, or after surgery, depending on the occasion and how long the patient remained conscious. It was convenience with a side of calamity. Imagine sitting in your wooden chair, cloak draped aside, receiving both a fine new haircut and a rudimentary abscess drainage, perhaps even while your teeth were being pulled, all beneath the soft chime of the town bell and the distant scent of cabbage stew. Naturally, hygiene in this setting was aspirational. Surgeons didn't yet know about germ theory, so sterilization meant wiping the blade on one's apron and declaring it clean enough for Jeffrey. Instruments might be reused countless times before someone had the radical thought to rinse them in wine. Alcohol, at the very least, counted as both sanitizer and courage potion. Interestingly enough, the role of barbers expanded in part because trained physicians, those blessed beings who read Latin and studied texts by Galen, refused to sully their hands with such manual labor. Surgery, after all, involved touching things: blood, pus, eyebrows. The university-educated physician preferred theory, diagrams, and idealized debates about the four humors. And so, physical activities were politely delegated to the barbers, who charged less, worked more, and occasionally produced results. Barber surgeons even accompanied armies. Picture it: a battlefield echoing with clashing swords. While off in a tent, our heroic barber both removes an arrow from a soldier's thigh and trims his mustache so he looks presentable in the face of certain doom. Licensing, rudimentary at best. Training often came from apprenticeship, trial and error, and an impressive resistance to fainting at the sight of blood. If your barber surgeon smelled vaguely of old onions and anxiety, that probably meant experience. Certificates were luxuries. Scars and calluses spoke volumes. And like any small business, location mattered. In towns, barber surgeons set up shop near butcher shops, arguably for convenience, arguably because townspeople could get confused and wander into either establishment, depending on how quickly they needed the bleeding done. A truly efficient errand run could find you picking up lamb shanks and losing molars in one brisk visit. Over time, the role of barber surgeons shifted, especially as surgical knowledge slowly decoupled from the hair care industry. By the 17th century, a clearer line separated those who wielded scissors from those who sawed bones. The professions diverged, and barbers were left to ply their trade at a less bloodthirsty pace. Still, for a dram of history's strange concoction, medicine, vanity, and desperation, all in one surprisingly capable person, nothing quite captures the era like the medieval barber surgeon. They were a little bit dangerous, a little bit stylish, and just hygienic enough to keep the patient and the customer coming back. Now, let us drift gently onward, to a place where public fountains flowed not with wine, but with other things entirely. Just as you settle in beneath your blanket, warm and cocooned, imagine yourself drifting down the cobbled alleys of a medieval town, stone buildings, timber frames, and the distant clop of hooves on uneven roads. The air is heavy, humid with centuries-old secrets. Tonight, we follow our noses, albeit reluctantly, into one of the more aromatic mysteries of the Middle Ages: medieval laundry, or more specifically, the conspicuous lack thereof. Now, you might think that the people of the past simply didn't care about cleanliness, but that would be horribly unfair and only partially disgusting. You see, medieval folks did try to keep tidy by the standards of the time. They scrubbed their hands with herbs. They sometimes bathed, from time to unfortunate time. But laundering their clothes was an altogether different beast. In our world, doing laundry means hurling your garments into a box, pressing some buttons, and waiting while it spins like a caffeinated hedgehog doing laps in a bucket. Back then, Well, it was more like enrolling in a soggy, drawn-out battle against fabric. First, everything had to be soaked in water. And not just any water, often river water, which, by the 14th century, was little more than a compost smoothie of waste, fish bits, and the occasional mysterious floating vegetable. This was the same river that carried off chamber pot donations and tannery leftovers, so the idea of freshness is more conceptual than real. Then came the detergent, which was not so much Tide as it was extra-strength medieval improvisation. Here, our dear protagonist was lye, a powerful caustic substance made by filtering water through wood ashes. Yes, ashes. Just imagine your entire wardrobe taking a hot bath in fireplace dust tea. It cleaned. In the same way a wildfire cleans a forest, thoroughly, radically, and with an unnerving crackle. Once scrubbed within an inch of their seams on a washboard, a charming term for a flat plank with ridges that doubled as an instrument in certain Appalachian bands. Clothes were wrung out and hung to dry. No dryers, just the wind and a collective prayer that it wouldn't rain or snow or be stolen by a wandering goose. This ordeal was so miserable that washing clothes happened only as often as absolutely necessary, which was rarely. If clothing stood up on its own or changed colours on a molecular level, perhaps then it was time. And speaking of stand-up clothes, let's explore underclothes, a sensitive but illuminating topic. Most medieval people wore a linen shirt or shift against the skin. This gave the outer clothes a small break from the front lines of sweat, spills, and general bodily enthusiasm. Linen, while less glamorous than velvet or brocade, was the unsung hygiene hero of the day because, thanks to its smoother weave, it was easier to wash. Of course, easy is relative. Washing linen still involved the ashwater apocalypse and an enthusiastic whack with a laundry beetle. A flattened wooden paddle used to beat garments senseless until they obeyed the laws of cleanliness or gave up entirely. So how did people cope between washes? Glad you asked. They beat their clothes with sticks in the open air to release dust and fleas, and brushed them down with stiff instruments, not unlike what you might use on a horse or a very muddy dog. And perfumes? Oh, they abounded, especially for the upper classes, who could douse themselves in rose water or exotic mixtures of herbs and spices. Though, rather than masking odour, it more often created a bouquet of smells that might be best described as medieval soup. And then there was the economy of fabric. Clothes weren't often washed because people might have only 1 or 2 sets, and those had to last. Their tunics and hose were patched, repaired, and passed down more like family law than fashion statements. Still, laundry day, if one must call it that, was a sacred event in its own dismal way. Sometimes entire groups would gather by rivers to pound away communally, sharing gossip, bread, and questionable sniff tests. It was elaborate, deeply inconvenient, and left your only tunic slightly ash-scented and unevenly dry. But this shared struggle formed a quiet kind of bond. The truth is, medieval folks didn't bathe their clothes often, not out of laziness, but out of exhaustion, pragmatism, and an unspoken alliance with their ever-thinning fabrics. And as strange as it may sound, letting a garment rest until its aroma declared independence was simply normal. Now, with the whisper of wind on drying linen fluttering through your dreams, let's leave the launderers to their beetles and breezes, and see what awaited medieval nobles inside their perfumed, oddly drafty castles. Peering through the velvet fog of medieval dawns, one might spot a peculiar scene unfolding on the cobbled edges of a market town. A wobbly cart drawn by a suspiciously moody donkey, swaying with barrels labelled urine. Yes, you heard that correctly. Urine. It wasn't a delivery mistake, nor some sort of rustic prank. In fact, it was serious business. Because in the Middle Ages, nothing said clean like a nice bucket of week-old human pee. Before the invention of lavender-scented floor cleaners or lemon-fresh bleaches, there was medieval ammonia. And by ammonia, we mean, you guessed it, stale urine. This glorious golden fluid, referred to quite poetically as chamber lye, was harvested from the peasant population with all the enthusiasm of a royal tax. Housewives would dutifully collect it in stone jugs, sometimes designated for a particular neighbour, not unlike the way one might label Tupperware at the office fridge. This one's Ethel's wee, hands off. Why all this effort? Because people used it to scrub their laundry. It turns out that urine, left to ferment, makes a surprisingly effective cleaning agent. The ammonia content helps strip grease from woolen garments and set dyes into cloth. In full fairness, it worked. It just didn't smell terribly helpful in the process. But medieval noses had long since surrendered to sensory overload. The overpowering stink of laundry day was more of a community event than a surprise. To appreciate this, imagine doing your laundry the medieval way. First, soak your finest and least lice-ridden garments in a tub of old pee. Then, wring them out with your notoriously unwashed hands. Rinse? Perhaps. Dry, if the weather allowed and the pigs hadn't stolen your drying line. Fragrance? Optional and mostly wishful thinking. And while we're steeped in this golden topic, let's not forget the hair care enthusiasts of the era. Roman and later medieval barbers occasionally suggested using wee-based rinses to lighten hair. Blonde was in fashion, probably because it made lice easier to spot. But even the vainest gallant had to question whether brighter locks were worth wafting odour outhouse. Now, lest you accuse the entire medieval continent of being unrepentant stink enthusiasts, allow us to drift east to one particular oasis of domestic civility, the Islamic world. In cities like Baghdad and Cordoba, bathing culture was thriving while European spires festered with pigeons and plague. Public baths, known as hammams, were serene sanctuaries of lather and steam. Here, bathers would exfoliate with soap, scented with rose oil, and dry themselves on crisply woven cloths. It was hygienic. It was elegant. It was not Europe. Back in the West, many still believed that water was dangerous unless attempting to drown in it. Physicians of the time carried a deep suspicion of bathing, convinced that soaking one's body opened the pores, which allowed evil miasmas, bad air full of sins and sniffling, to sneak in and cause disease. So while their clothes were occasionally introduced to a vat of fermented potpourri, many people's bodies met water as rarely as royal taxes met fairness. But these ideas weren't born of pure laziness. After all, medieval people didn't relish smelling foul. It just sort of happened, like soup boiling itself over a reluctant fire. Access, belief, and plumbing conspired against them. Wells could freeze in winter. Rivers ran suspiciously brown. And those who lived near the coast had other problems. Chiefly, seagulls with weaponized opinions. Among the more delightful attempts at personal sanitation was the medieval passion for pomanders, small, perforated balls of fragrance worn on the body or dangled from belts. Think of these as wearable air fresheners. They contained a charming mix of herbs, spices, and surprise, sometimes ambergris, a waxy substance vomited by whales, which meant that while many a noble lady may have smelled like citrus and clove, it came with just the faintest whiff of mysterious sea mammal. And who could forget the nosegay, those modest bouquets of posies clutched delicately to one's nose to ward off the less delicate aromas of city life. Carried often in the sleeves or even stitched into hats, these little floral defences were the medieval equivalent of covering your nose with your hoodie on public transport. So, amid the swish of grassy gowns and the clink of humanity's crusted undergarments, the middle years of Europe trundled along, washed in myth, superstition, and occasionally in day-old chamber lie. And yet, as the carts rolled on, heavy with the best intentions and the worst odours, a curious transformation was beginning in towns you might not expect. Let's drift toward one such town, a place where monks weren't just chanting, but scrubbing, where soap didn't just sit in theory, it sudsed, faintly, like a whisper of better hygiene to come. Somewhere between the clanging jug of ale and the persistent scratch of woolen trousers, the medieval person wrestled with yet another sticky situation. Summer. Ah yes, summer. That turbulent waltz of sunshine and stench, where the month of July arrived like a caffeinated troubadour, loud, hot, and overstaying his welcome. You might think of medieval summer as a charming patchwork of blooming meadows and birdsong, but in truth, it was more of a cinnamon-scented fever dream, if the cinnamon had been replaced with fermented goat sweat. You see, there were no antiperspirants in medieval times. There were no roll-ons, sprays, or lavender-infused bath bombs promising a 24-hour freshness. What people did have was the fine art of denial and a cloak, sometimes two cloaks. Now imagine you're a peasant. You wake at dawn to the sweet lullaby of a rooster personally attacking your eardrums. You smear a bit of barley mash on your face because it's the closest thing to exfoliation, and you head off to the fields. The sun bats its golden lashes at you, and within 20 minutes, your undershirt is soaked in something that is definitely not holy water. By midday, you've turned into a walking potpourri of hay, sweat, pig, and determination. But so has everyone else. The entire village has quietly agreed not to notice. Personal hygiene, back then, was less about single-use wipes and more about collective humility. When everybody smells like a distressed goat, no one smells like a bad distressed goat. It wasn't all filth and futility, though. Some medieval folks made valiant attempts to combat the simmering soup of summer. Herbal remedies were all the rage. And by remedies, we mean bundles of dried rosemary decorated your armpits like a Christmas centerfold. Sage and mint were carefully tucked into bodices and under hats, creating the medieval equivalent of Glade plugins. Wealthier citizens, who spent less time harvesting potatoes and more time contemplating tapestries, had a few more options. Some dabbed themselves with rosewater, an elegant splash that masked most sins, for about 12 minutes. Others simply avoided the sun altogether, lounging indoors among musty drapes with windows barely cracked open. And yes, before you ask, there were people who bathed in summer, in rivers if they were adventurous, in wooden tubs if they were rich, or in public bathhouses, which were somewhere between a spa and a soup kitchen with more nudity. But by the 14th century, bathhouses started getting a bad reputation. People grew more suspicious of warm water. It was believed to open the pores, making one vulnerable to all sorts of mischievous miasmas. Better to sweat in full armour, apparently, than bathe your sins wide open where a passing breeze might betray you. Of course, clothes didn't help matters much. Linen undershirts were the humble heroes of summer, absorbent, breathable, and forever clinging to the hope that they'd be washed before next week's sheep fair. But over them came woolen tunics, thick cloaks, velvet robes if you were fancy. and all the delicious thermal inertia of a baked potato. Let us not forget those who labored on horseback, messengers delivering urgent scrolls full of misspelled Latin, knights occasionally jousting to resolve a minor inheritance dispute. Horses, noble creatures though they are, added their own ripe contribution to the summertime symphony. A day spent riding behind one was like following a living incense stick made of hay, leather, and digestive ambition. And yet, through this blistering choreography of odours and effort, medieval people remained remarkably composed. There were feasts and festivals still. Music played, bread baked, ale flowed. Perhaps misery loves company, but sweat, apparently, loves a fiddle tune and freshly baked eel pie. The scent of summer lingered like a long song then, sometimes unpleasant, often inescapable, but unmistakably real. And beneath it all, a quiet sort of endurance bloomed, one that said, "Yes, I may smell like a lost cheese, but I've survived another summer without melting like soft butter into my shoes." For some, the answer to summer's scent lay in scented talismans. Small linen bags filled with marjoram, thyme, or crushed cloves, worn around the neck or tied to the belt. Not actually effective, but charmingly hopeful. Medieval optimism in shrink-wrapped herbal form. And so, as the sun begins to dip behind the thatched roof cottages, casting long syrupy shadows across the fields, let us wander down one more winding path, deeper into the subtle sciences of stink and the curious habits of those who fought it. Let us now drift quietly into one of the most curiously scented corners of medieval society, monasteries. Yes, those towering stone havens of piety and parchment were also home to some surprisingly pungent aromas. You might expect cleanliness from places devoted to God, prayer, and illuminated manuscripts. But the monks had other things on their minds. Mostly sin, salvation, and whether Brother Bernard was hoarding the good cheese under his cot. Now, monks lived their lives according to strict rules, most famously, the rule of St. Benedict, written back when people thought taking a bath more than once a season qualified as vanity. The Benedictines in particular were all about humility, discipline, and routines so regular you could set a candle clock to them. But personal hygiene? That was filed somewhere between not dying of plague and don't talk during dinner. Medieval monasteries weren't dirty by accident, mind you. In fact, they were relatively progressive for their time. Monks even had communal latrines built over running water, which in the 12th century was about as fancy as plumbing got. Except, well, sewage kind of had a wandering spirit back then. Even the most architecturally ambitious monastery couldn't fully outwit gravity, mud, and rats with master's degrees in tunneling. And then there was bathing. Some monastic orders actually encouraged it. The Cluniacs, for example, allowed their monks to bathe twice a year. Luxurious, right? It was scheduled like a feast day. You'd think Brother Paul might have circled Bath Thursday on the monastery calendar with a trembling quill and a pious tear. Now, some monks took personal aversion to cleanliness as an act of ascetic devotion. St. Francis of Assisi, for instance, wasn't hugely bothered by body odor. If anything, he wore it like a scratchy, invisible hair shirt. To suffer a stench, after all, was to suffer for God, which is deeply spiritual, but perhaps less so for the monk standing beside you at matins when yesterday's lentil broth is staging a comeback through your pores. And let's not forget the cowls. Those voluminous hoods and robes were less a fashion statement and more a wearable greenhouse, made of heavy wool, rarely washed, and often passed from one monk to another like a sacred smelly heirloom. They trapped every waft puff, and spiritual fume like a soul-scented teapot. But there was a silver lining. Monks planted gardens, and in those herb patches grew medicinal and aromatic plants, lavender, rosemary, mint, and thyme, not just for stews or poultices, but also to sprinkle on the floor, rub on the skin, or chew while attempting to read Latin without drooling on the parchment. Some monks wore small pouches of herbs around their necks, like medieval air fresheners, conveniently dangling where the nose might catch its only break of the day. It's important to know that monks also brewed beer, gallons of it. Why water alone, when beer was safer, tastier, and could take the edge off the reality that your choir partner hadn't touched soap since Advent? Warm ale fogged the air, mingling with incense and centuries of accumulated parchment dust, until the monastery smelled less like holiness and more like a tavern run by a rather spiritual librarian. Still, life wasn't all musty books and fermented barley. Daily life was spiritual, repetitive, and deeply rhythmic. Think Gregorian chants echoing through cold stone halls, footsteps padding steadily along cloisters, bees humming in the abbey garden, and through it all, the quiet perfume of blessed imperfection. The monks may have smelled like a holy bouquet of sweat, cabbage, and candle wax, but they kept the light of learning alive through centuries of chaos. So, while modern noses might twitch at the thought, there's something paradoxically comforting in the idea. A monastery may not have smelled like fresh linen, but it smelled, undeniably, like commitment, like a life fully given over to things greater than soap. As evening bells toll softly in the distance, imagine their low, solemn chime echoing over dew-damp fields, through misty cloisters, and weaving into dreamlike stillness. Ahead lies a darker shadow of medieval aroma, one not cloaked in prayer or parchment, but in leather straps, steel suits, and a great deal of unpleasant horseback sweat. Yes, we're heading toward the strange olfactory world of night. Let us wander now into the vast, unventilated halls of medieval fashion, where clothing wasn't just a style statement. It was a full-time olfactory adventure. For if one were to judge a person by their scent in the Middle Ages, they might mistake a duke for a dung heap, and not entirely without reason. To begin, imagine the layers. Clothes weren't so much worn as layered like a lasagna of wool. A nobleman's typical ensemble included a linen shirt, a long-sleeved tunic, perhaps another tunic over that one, hose that clung bravely to the legs, and a surcoat, all cinched tightly at the waist with a belt. For women, the game was similar, only with the addition of trailing sleeves and hemlines that swept through every street slosh puddle of chamber pot runoff. It was less about comfort and more about proving you could afford enough fabric to exhaust a small sheep farm. Now, clothing in the Middle Ages had one very important feature. It very rarely met a washtub. Linen underclothes, perhaps washed when the stars aligned and it wasn't considered too extravagant. Woolen outerwear, seldom, if ever. Laundering was laborious, water was precious, and soap was often more like a paste of ash and animal fat, smelling suspiciously like regret and lard. Most opted simply to air things out. In other words, the wind was your detergent. This brings us to the curious case of the medieval wardrobe staple, the perfume pouch. These delightful satchels of dried herbs, flowers, and spices were worn close to the body, not to impress admirers with your herbal sophistication, but to mask the unmistakable tang of your own human fermentation. Lavender, rosemary, cloves, nature's brave attempt to duel with biology. Occasionally, these pouches were sewn into clothes or disguised as tasteful jewelry. like the pomander, a decorative orb meant to safely house sweet-smelling substances, while radiating the delicate olfactory message of, "I know I reek, but I care." And speaking of accessories, let's not overlook the hat. Hats weren't just for keeping off the cold. They worked overtime as grease absorbers. Since many Europeans believed that bathing could weaken the body, hair washing was a rare luxury. Oily scalps and fashion-forward felt caps shook hands often. In fact, in certain circles, a shiny hairless spot on top, not caused by baldness, but by accumulated hair oil wearing away the hat lining, was practically a badge of honor. But perhaps the most audacious contribution to this atmosphere of zest-ridden couture came from fur. Rich people loved fur collars, fur-lined cloaks, and fur-trimmed sleeves that swayed dramatically when they waved their wine-stained goblets. Problem was, fur couldn't easily be washed without destroying it. So mites, fleas, and whatever had taken up residence in your hedgehog-themed stole were yours to cuddle indefinitely. If it itched, one simply scratched, with poise of course, and carried on with the feast. Curiously, some laws tried to impose a bit of scented civility. In cities like Paris and Florence, there were rules limiting how much perfume, soap, or scented oil residents were allowed to wear. Worried people might begin smelling too foreign, or worse, too clean. Truly, nothing says medieval elegance like a statute, reminding you not to outshine your neighbor's musk. For those with no access to perfumes or pouches, however, nature provided its own bleak solution. Outdoor laborers and peasants, living lives of honest toil and mud-caked feet, often embraced the fragrance of the fields, and since everyone else smelled similarly, well, it simply became the social wallpaper. Imagine a communal scent wherein everyone's various bodily efforts, be they milking goats, churning butter, or just trying not to faint in the sun, blended into a symphony of effort and the earth. One didn't judge, one simply adapted. Yet amidst this aromatic anarchy, there was beauty too. A sun-warmed tunic, worn every day until it remembered your body like a second skin. The faint scent of hay woven into woolen robes after a harvest. The mingled spices of mead spilled absent-mindedly during celebration. Texture, scent, and time itself clung to every piece of clothing, until fashion became not just something you wore, but something you lived within. And while the medieval wardrobe may not have come with a laundry tag or a fresh scent guarantee, it wrapped its wearer in the story of their own daily survival. Damp hems, embroidered sleeves, and all. Now, let's peek beyond these fur-trimmed cloaks to another curious source of medieval aroma, that very misunderstood and villainized vessel known as the medieval toilet. Drift softly forward, if you dare. Long before we argued about deodorant scents in the pharmacy aisle, ocean breeze, Arctic musk, charcoal rainforest storm, or whatever faintly aggressive fragrance is trending, people in medieval villages couldn't even agree on what clean meant. Some believed it was spiritual, some thought it was visual, and a fair few assumed as long as no rats were actively nesting in your hair, you were doing fine. This brings us to a truly critical medieval institution, the bathhouse. Or rather, let's say, the bathish house, because while public bathing may sound like a progressive spa-like affair, it was more biblical sauna meets vaguely suspicious soup kitchen. Now, early in the Middle Ages, bathing wasn't just tolerated, it was downright trendy. In fact, in bustling centres like Paris or London, you could toss a stone and probably hit a bathhouse, a monk, or a horse cart delivering eels. Bathhouses were social hubs, places where people gathered to soak in warmth, swap gossip, and inadvertently stew in each other's microbes. Think medieval hot tub party, minus the champagne, and plus one very confused goose someone accidentally brought indoors. Some establishments were gender segregated, others weren't, and others still operated under what the church soon viewed as morally uncertain lighting conditions. See, as the 12th and 13th centuries rolled in, things began to get steamy in more ways than one. Bathhouses, once wholesome-ish places to rinse off dust and sin, slowly acquired reputations. There were rumours, whispers even, of fleshly temptation happening between bucket refills and exfoliating scrubs with coarse linen rags. The church, eternally suspicious of anyone having fun while damp, decided to intervene. Moral panic brewed alongside the bathwater. Bishops wrinkled their noses. Pamphlets were written. Emperors, including Holy Roman ones with names longer than their hair care routines, began passing edicts against co-ed steaming, if you will. In short, the bathhouse fell from grace. And yet, not everyone was giving up their bath time bliss. The upper classes, always keen on doing whatever peasants weren't allowed to do, began relocating their bathing practices into their own homes or countryside manors. There, surrounded by jug-pouring servants and slightly judgmental cats, nobles took their baths in massive wooden barrels lined with cloth and filled with heated water steeped with herbs. Rosemary, lavender, perhaps a hint of arrogance. A person of noble stature might bathe once every few weeks, the medieval equivalent of a spa retreat, with rose petals gently scattered across the surface to disguise the steam's less romantic aromas. Unfortunately for the olfactory nerves, these baths were seldom emptied after one use. That would be wasteful. Rather, each family member would take their turn in the same water, starting with the father, then the mother, then the children, by descending order of value. Sorry, age. Which brings us back to the expression, "Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater," a phrase that was alarmingly very literal. Meanwhile, back in the villages where bathhouses had shuttered or had simply rebranded as fish markets, people had to find alternative ways of cleaning up. One such approach was the seasonal bath. Yes, seasonal. Not in a pumpkin spice way, in a bathing with the frequency of a waxing moon kind of way. The May bath was one such tradition. After a long, muddy winter, the coming of spring meant a chance to gather, heat water over open flames, scrub the soot off your ankles, and pray nobody walked in during your scrubbing of anything else. Clothes were washed in rivers, and hair, especially long hair, was rinsed with herbs and edible oils, provided your goat hadn't eaten them all yet. Some folks opted for dry bathing, the art of rubbing one's skin briskly with coarse fabrics to remove dirt, much like sanding wood, and just as gentle. Others relied heavily on perfume sachets or aromatic vinegars dabbed on pulse points to mask whatever their bodies were doing naturally. Speaking of masking smells, there's perhaps no better evidence of medieval scent strategies than the noble's pomander, a hollow, often ornate metal orb containing spongy little bags filled with spice mixes. The idea was to hang it from your belt and let it dangle about, releasing pleasant aromas as you walked. Basically, the ancient forerunner to a pine-scented car freshener, except instead of deodorizing a car, it was deodorizing yourself. Of course, if you happen to be poor, your deodorizing options were limited to standing upwind and hoping no one got too close. Still, despite the closing of bathhouses and the rise of suspicion around hot water and good times, The need for cleanliness never fully went away. It just adapted, as did the stench. But in the shadows of society's more fragrant failings, another character was waiting to make a polite but powerful entrance. Linen. Soft, cooling, quietly luxurious linen. A material so obsessively laundered that it might just hold the key to surviving medieval hygiene, or at least enduring it while smelling slightly less tragic. Of all the perils medieval people faced, sword fights, malnutrition, and surprise fires caused by candles getting just a little too cozy with the hay, one of the greatest threats to harmony and health was the medieval laundry situation, or lack thereof. Now, the term doing the laundry in the Middle Ages might more accurately be phrased as ignoring the laundry until it begged for mercy. This wasn't entirely the fault of the people, mind you. Soap, as we know it, was about as rare as a dragon that cleaned up after itself, and detergents hadn't yet made their bubbly debut. Instead, our medieval forebears had soap-like substances made from ashes and animal fats, effective in theory, but about as gentle as scrubbing a silk blouse with gravel. Washing clothes was, unsurprisingly, a massive ordeal. It required not just water, but a sizable amount of effort, time, and upper body strength. Water had to be hauled from streams, heated over open fires, and poured into wooden tubs. Then came the scrubbing, the beating, the rinsing, and the wringing. And finally, the drying, preferably on a sunny day without rampaging sheep or wind-blown ashes from someone's particularly enthusiastic cooking fire. And so, many people simply opted not to do it. A decent tunic might go weeks or even months between washes. Some garments were never washed at all. Instead, they were aired out, draped over bushes, shaken out by hopeful hands, or hung up where smoke from the hearth could do its best to defunk them. This method didn't so much cleanse as confuse the odors into retreat. Naturally, the linens closest to the skin were washed more frequently. Chemises and undershirts, the cotton or linen buffers between bare bodies and wool coats, took the brunt of the sweat and were, in theory, cleaned with something like regularity. But regularity is a term best understood loosely here. In some households, once a fortnight. In others, once per lunar eclipse. Monasteries, ever keen on doing things very slowly and with great ceremony, had laundry weeks when all the monks' underclothes were washed together in grand, nearly festive communal cleansings. Imagine rows of solemn monks in sandals supervising the soaking bloomers of their brothers while chanting quietly about piety. Sleepy, serene, and slightly scented with damp linen. Public washhouses did exist in some towns, usually located on the edges of rivers or near wells. These became social gathering points for washwomen, places to swap gossip, air grievances, and accidentally fall in, while battling particularly stubborn stains. Laundry was less of a chore and more of a muddy sport, involving much sloshing, wringing, and gritted-teeth dialogue about ungrateful husbands and impractical buttons. But not everyone wanted to bring their underpants into the public eye. Even if those underpants resembled loosely stitched potato sacks. For the modest or the aristocratic, private laundering was done by professional laundresses, women of great arm strength and haunted memories. These poor souls bore the burden of dirty tunics, sour-smelling doublets, and the inexplicable stickiness of medieval children's outerwear, which may or may not have involved goose feathers. In castles, senior servants assigned laundry duties would also have to sweet-talk the steward into giving up precious soap or wood for boiling water. These were commodities too valuable to waste on frivolities like cleaning. After all, why use the good wood to wash a duke's hose when you could use it to roast a pheasant or heat the solar? There were occasional fads of cleanliness, little sparkles of hygiene in the dusty gloom. For a brief moment in the 14th century, thanks to the influence of Moorish culture in Spain and parts of southern Europe, fragrant soaps and frequent linen changes became the rage among the upper class. Nobles perfumed their clothing with lavender, rosewater, or, for the daring, cinnamon. Alas, like all fashion trends, this too passed and was replaced by other priorities like jousting. And so, the laundry limped along, slowly, muscularly, soaked in herbs and stubbornness. But not all the scents of medieval clothing were unpleasant. On rare, crisp mornings, tunics that had been hung by rivers, flapping in the breeze, soaking up the steam of wood smoke and crushed rosemary, might have smelled almost poetic, almost like fabric trying to remember what it felt like to be clean. So, as they tucked into their scratchy, vinegary bed sheets at the end of each day, medieval folks could at least rest easy knowing that tomorrow they still wouldn't smell any worse, not noticeably anyway. And speaking of bedtime rituals and well-worn fabrics, next we drift toward a chamber far more fragrant than most, where the nobility had their own ideas about how rank and rankness were best handled. Soap, as we know it today, that slippery little miracle of lavender-scented civility, was once a rather different beast in the medieval world. And by different, I mean frequently unpleasant, occasionally alarming, and only loosely associated with the idea of cleanliness. Let us drift gently, like a puff of lye-scented steam, into the rustic soap-making world of the Middle Ages, where chemistry met superstition in a truly curious fusion. Picture it: an old wooden shack on the edge of town, smoke curling from a crude kiln, and a woman stirring a bubbling cauldron full of, well, animal fat and ashes. Yes, the original soap was not handcrafted by smiling artisans in aprons, but rather cooked up from leftover bacon grease and the remnants of last Thursday's chimney sweepings. The technique was roughly as follows. Take a generous quantity of rendered animal fat, tallow from sheep or lard from pigs, and blend it with lye, which conveniently could be made by pouring water through wood ashes. This unholy alliance of grease and caustic substance was then boiled together until it achieved a consistency some described as thick, others as monstrous, and all as indisputably pungent. Soap, during this time, wasn't scented with gardenia or bergamot. No. It smelled like it had lost a fight with a fireplace. And while it did achieve a rudimentary form of cleanliness, removing dirt, grease, and perhaps a bad relationship or two, it also had a reputation for burning skin if the lye ratio went astray, which it often did. Medieval lye was not precisely measured. It was more of a guess, with consequences. Now, in fairness, some parts of Europe managed to elevate this soap situation. The city of Aleppo, in what is now Syria, had been producing a luxurious soap using olive oil and laurel for centuries. Smooth, fragrant, and far less liable to remove your top layer of skin. This Aleppo soap became a strong influence on trade routes and eventually morphed into the famed Castile soap of medieval Spain. But for your average English peasant, the soap experience remained very much a test of fortitude and faith. Not only was soap erratic in quality, it was also rather expensive. Animal fat was valuable. It had to come from somewhere after all. And burning wood to harvest ashes wasn't exactly a glamorous or efficient process. So for the common folk, soap was used sparingly, if at all. It might be employed for washing clothes or treating the occasional unspeakable itch. but certainly not for daily ablutions. That would be wasteful, almost suspiciously clean in fact. Indeed, an over-fondness for soap could invite concerns. Excessive washing was seen by some as a form of vanity or even heresy. Rumours occasionally circulated that soap could open the pores to sin, a poetic, if logically porous argument. Better to smell piously like a goat than to tempt fate with lemon-scented indulgence, or so the logic went. The few who ventured into the soap trade as professionals were a hardy bunch. Soap makers often lived just outside city limits, their work considered so odious, for both the smell and the fire hazard, that they were politely encouraged to set up shop somewhere else, anywhere else, perhaps near a river, or ideally in a different valley. And as if things weren't already complicated enough, some sorts of cleansing agents back then weren't soaps at all. There were cleansing grains, creams made from ground legumes, and even fuller's earth, a type of clay used more commonly on wool, but sometimes, in a pinch, applied to people. You can imagine the results. Despite all this, humanity persisted in its hopes of not smelling like an uprooted turnip, and slowly, over centuries, we refined soap making. Recipes improved. Lye was eventually tamed. Fragrance, that flirtatious addition, was finally invited to the party. But during the medieval days, soap was a gamble, a gritty, strangely alkaline gamble. As the moon rises higher over our dreaming medieval landscape, let us leave the soap makers to their cauldrons and cinders and tiptoe away from their smoky sheds. The question lingers. If soap was rare, baths were rarer, and perfumes were basically floral armor. How then did one handle body odors on a daily basis? A mystery, best explored on a winding walk through the world of medieval clothes. They too absorbed more than style. As twilight edged along the timbers of a medieval cottage, leaping softly upon straw pallets and clinging to the chisel marks of wooden beams, the townsfolk of Europe prepared for a nightly ritual that was, puts on dramatic voice, not bathing. Instead, they bedded down amid familiar scents: damp wool, soot, garlic breath, and something faintly suggestive of turnips gone free range. But let's not judge. Hygiene, in the medieval mind, was less about smelling like a spring meadow, and more about protecting oneself from disease, evil spirits, and, surprisingly, demons with poor table manners. You see, the church had a somewhat complicated relationship with water. Monasteries were among the few places that maintained rudimentary cleanliness, but even their divine spa days were more about symbolic purity than scrubbing behind the ears. For the average peasant or townsperson, water was regarded with a certain suspicion. It flowed, it changed, it froze, it summoned frogs. What even was it? And so, we arrive at an important feature of medieval cleanliness: the dry bath. This spa experience involved a cloth, vigorously applied, and perhaps a few sprigs of mint tucked into the collar for flair. It was believed that water could open the pores, dangerous little doorways through which illness might sneak its grubby fingers inside. Better to remain dutifully dusty than demonically damp. But some efforts were made. Barbers, being the Swiss Army knives of the time, didn't just do hair. They also handled surgeries, tooth pulling, and, yes, some basic hygiene services. Our medieval multitaskers would offer a shave, a haircut, and perhaps even a brisk toweling, all while discussing local plague gossip or which saint could cure boils. At home, there was always the old standby, the wash tub, dragged indoors and filled with water, hopefully warmed near a hearth. This rather ambitious undertaking required coordination, firewood, and a heroic disregard for modesty. Families often reuse the same tub of bath water in descending order of age, leading to the famous modern expression, "Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater." Yes, it's as literal as it sounds. Poor last-born Timmy bathed in opaque mystery soup, bobbing gently between someone's corn husk and an unidentifiable elbow. And yet, despite our modern nostrils recoiling at medieval musk, it's worth noting that they did try. They scented themselves with herbs, rosemary in their clothes, lavender between the bedsheets. Perfumed pomanders dangled from belts or were tucked under noses, offering portable olfactory reprieve. The upper classes took this a step further, with velvet gloves doused in spice oils, or letter writing executed only on rosewater-soaked parchment. Nothing says, "I long for your love," like fennel-scented handwriting. Still, certain professions were beyond hope. Tanners working with animal hides treated in fermented urine, that's right, intentionally fermented, found themselves forever perfumed by what one could politely describe as aggressively rustic. Executioners too, shunned from society and soaked in gore fumes, probably weren't winning any medieval deodorant commercials. And the streets. Picture this. Narrow alleys bustling with donkeys, poultry and merchants bellowing over a pungent tapestry of rotting vegetables, fish entrails, and the occasional unintentional shoe contribution left by a goose. Cities tried their best with regulations calling for weekly waste removal, but enforcement was enthusiastic in theory, chaotic in practice. If you lived near a river, perhaps the breeze offered occasional relief. Then again, many rivers doubled as open sewers and fish markets, so one sniff could be either invigorating or emotionally traumatic. Fashion didn't help matters. Layers of linen, wool and fur created a kind of medieval crockpot effect. Once encased in tunic, leggings, undergarments and fur-trimmed cloak, the average person carried a personal weather system. The scent, while unique to each individual, rarely inspired poetry. And yet, in candle-lit taverns and beneath vaulted cathedral ceilings, people still pressed palms in, greeting, whispered secrets cheek to cheek, and danced in festivals without collapsing from each other's aroma. Normal was just normal. In their world, you didn't notice the stink because everyone shared it. It was the cozy, communal musk of survival. Damp cloaks drying by firelight, smoke curling up chimneyless roofs, onions sizzling in pork fat. Not offensive, but comforting in a strange, earthy way. As the moon rose over cobblestone streets and bell towers sighed into the silence, the familiar perfume of old wood and wool-laced breath settled in for the night. The world was still, except, perhaps, for one poor apothecary, fiddling with dried sage and vinegar, trying somehow, against all odds, to invent odorless soap. And speaking of unlikely inventors, the next whispers of sleep will carry us to an unexpected king, with an equally unexpected obsession, bathing, by the time you arrived at the medieval dining table, or more likely, the common room floor a dog just sneezed on. You weren't just hungry. You were layered in 2 weeks of body odor, faint traces of sheep, and a bouquet of smoky fireplace that would never quite leave your tunic again. But never fear, for the medieval banquet offered more than questionable meats and bucket wine. It offered smells, so very many smells. Let's drift slowly into one of those feasts, shall we? Picture it. Rough-hewn benches, straw scattered on the floor as if pretending to help, and platters of roasted whatever animal might have fallen over that week. The fragrance of mutton, onion, damp wool, and someone's long unwashed shoes all mingling gently beneath the vaulted ceilings. No candles scented with lavender and sandalwood here, unless lavender is code for boiled cabbage and failure. The truth is, for all their love of feasting and pageantry, the medieval nose had a heavy workload. Hygiene simply wasn't on the menu. Kitchens smoked like wildfire on a windy Tuesday. Garlic was applied liberally into food, poultices, and possibly even as a perfume. And fish was everywhere, salted, dried, smoked. It was like the population had collectively agreed that refrigeration was for cowards and they would simply battle the smell with optimism. Now, in case you need further reassurance that the Middle Ages were a sensory adventure, you'd be delighted or horrified to learn about the medieval nostril's greatest enemy, the gong farmer. Yes, dear dreamer, the gong farmer. It wasn't a whimsical job involving chimes and herbs. Oh no, a gong farmer cleaned cesspits, nightly, under cover of darkness, with buckets. It was a job poorly paid in coin, liberally paid in character-building trauma, and typically performed while holding one's breath. These brave souls collected human waste from latrines and dumped the results far outside the town walls, ideally somewhere wolves wouldn't complain. This was not a society unaware of smells. They noticed them. They commented. They just didn't have resources or, frankly, plumbing. Cities teemed with people, livestock, and a confusing mixture of ambition and excrement. Streets doubled as sewers, with waste tossed out windows accompanied by a helpful shout, "Gardez l'eau," French for "watch out for the water," which sounds charming until you remember what kind of water we're referencing. And then came the perfumes and potions, crusades in a bottle. The wealthy tried to combat the storm of smell with distillations of roses, spices, and strong alcohols, daring enough to stand up to the nasal siege. Sometimes they wore sachets of herbs around their necks, like tiny, fragrant shields, or filled pomanders, little balls of pierced silver filled with cloves, cinnamon, and self-deception. Even doctors believed smells impacted your health. The miasma theory, the idea that diseases were spread by bad air, dominated thinking until surprisingly recently. Plague doctors in those infamous beak-like masks stuffed their nostrils with fragrant herbs to avoid contagion. Lavender, mint, and marjoram all took a shift up the bird's nose, not necessarily stopping any pathogens, but offering a pleasant break from, well, everything else. Monasteries fared a little better. Perhaps surprisingly, monks were among the cleaner cohorts in medieval society. Many orders bathed regularly, maintained latrines, and changed their robes. Eventually, but even holy cleanliness couldn't compete with the overwhelming ambient musk of your average serf-filled village. And so, everyone smelled terrible, unapologetically, eclectically, often communally. There was a sense that this was simply how life worked, like gravity, or the tendency for the bread to be crunchy enough to remove teeth. You might have your own special bouquet, say, eau de smiti with notes of horse, but you were surrounded by dozens more. Endless variations on a medieval theme. Yet, interestingly, people still fell in love, wrote poetry, wooed and wed, because even amid the funk and filth, people adjusted. The human nose, clever creature that it is, stopped smelling familiar aromas after a while. It simply surrenders. Love makes fools of us all, and apparently it made medieval people oblivious to the fact their beloved smelled like goat yogurt and despair. And so, dear listener, as the feast grows dim and the torches dwindle low, as the last onion pie is claimed and the minstrel soundly ignored, let yourself settle into the straw-strewn warmth of that pungent, unhygienic hall. For just one more scene remains, tucked at the edge of candlelight, an ending whispered in the steam of bathhouses and the ironic silence of medieval soap. Let's drift there together, gently, soon. And so, with our noses full of non-existent rosewater and our socks spiritually soaked from medieval mud, we drift now to the final little cul-de-sac in our cobblestone stroll through the past. A time when people feared drafts more than dragons, and soap was regarded with the same suspicion one might reserve today for text messages from an ex. But let us close our eyes and picture something lovely, because in truth, not all was stink and squalor in the Middle Ages. No, there was also music, and bread, and occasionally a good laugh in spite of the fleas. You see, even in the rankest corners of medieval life, the coal-dusted bathhouse dragging its last breath before the plague knocked, there remained a deep human persistence to try and smell just a little better. If the learned physicians hadn't tangled themselves into philosophical knots over humours and bile, they might have realised the simplest truth. People in every era have just done their best with what they had, even if what they had was goose fat and rosemary crushed into something that loosely qualified as a cleansing salve. Let's take a moment, just before our eyelids sink for the night, to appreciate the humble ways people tried. Peasants chewed mint to sweeten their breath, lest they offend a passing sheep. Nobles stuffed sachets of lavender down their sleeves and hoped nobody checked under their wigs. Priests swung censers full of frankincense, not only for divine ambience, but also, let's be honest, to fend off the human funk in the pews. One could hardly blame them. Nothing says praise be like a noseful of holy spice masking 3 weeks of fermented humanity. Of course, there were also those clever inventions that pushed the bouquet forward. Perfume bottles hidden in canes, like medieval Febreze. Pouches stuffed with dried herbs like basil and rue, worn around the neck like olfactory armor. And even scented gloves for those aristocrats who preferred their fingers to smell like an English summer, and not, well, whatever they had just eaten with their hands, which may or may not have been identifiable as food. Still, it's all rather charming, isn't it? Like a great-grandparent fumbling with Facebook. They didn't quite understand the whole picture, but they were trying. The medieval mindset was not necessarily one that prioritized body odor as an existential threat. After all, wasn't suffering part of spiritual enlightenment? If you reeked, perhaps that was just penance seeping through your pores. And while it's easy now, in our hot showers, rich with lather and lemon scent, to laugh at the sanitary missteps of centuries past, we must remember, smell is deeply tied to memory. The damp wood of a mead hall, the sharp tang of a smithy's forge, the crushed grass of a May Day festival, even the unmistakable aroma of horses, always horses, served as the smoky incense of the medieval world. They may have smelled terrible, yes, but they smelled together. So tonight, nestled into your clean sheets, you can count yourself among the lucky. History has brushed your hair and tucked you in. The bathwater has been drawn, figuratively, of course, and all the ghosts of smelly centuries have tiptoed quietly back to their era. Let the rattle of a distant cartwheel on plague-worn cobblestones lull you. Feel the cool hush of a stone abbey. Hear the sleepy babble of monks brewing something yeasty in the dark. No more leeches, no more lice. You're safe now, and very clean. Good night, time traveler. Sleep peacefully, and let the smell of the past waft away on the dream winds of forgetfulness.